Okay, our second speaker tonight is John Norman from Woods Bagot. John is an associate director at Woods Bagot, and he's been involved in another couple of buildings as part of this whole medical precinct up at this end of the campus. And we're delighted to be able to have him here to talk about the next two buildings.
One building, really.
Well, there you go.
It's two buildings being built to create one building. So that's where we're at. I think Andrew's stolen most of my commentary as well, so it'll be much faster than his, which is probably appropriate. Basically, going through the spaces as we talked about up in the biological sciences precinct. When we get there, there's more of a defined courtyard at the Michael Burt Gardens. There's more of a defined entry sort of sequence into the site. So the buildings that we were just discussing here are in here. There's a very defined entry through into the courtyard space. And when we looked at this building, there were options to have entries off the street, but we decided that it was more important to link the precinct than the building. So we sat in stage one, which is this area here, behind D26, which is this building here. And we said, let's use the existing entries, let's use the precinct that's been developed in the courtyard space to create the entries into this building. So it's kind of strange, this building at the moment, it's finished, it's been done. The only way you get in here is through a construction site. It relies on stage two to be a completed building. And essentially it reinforces the original sort of concepts that were done by the other buildings, which is to encourage the link through here. There's a future development through here, which is happening with the medical precinct, but the Chancellery Walk as a primary thoroughfare coming through, the gardens themselves, and then the entry into this precinct. So this is the layout that we ended up. It's still under a bit of development here, but probably the big difference between the way we approach this building is the activation of this space. And what we're trying to do is continue the streetscape down through the buildings, which I'll show you in a minute, but also it's to activate the Michael Burt Gardens and actually connect into it so that we're engaging with that space. When we originally got the project, there were some reference schemes that I won't go too far onto this, but basically we rationalised the schemes to create the ability to open into this space through opening the learning, and again, it's the same concepts that we were talking about before. These are your support labs, these are your open labs, this is your workplace, and then the space that joins the two buildings and connects through to the Wallace Worth building. So when we got it, it was a very square box. We looked at the space that was available on the site. We then cranked it open so that we could create more space in and allow for the opening of this space. So by building one building, we got the internal, it's sort of along the lines of the master plan, we got that extra space, the third space that was excellent in the principles. On the facades, we looked at, or the mass of the building, we looked at how we could connect in with the Wallace Worth building and its facade, and how we could bring that to an end at the gate 11, which is a natural sort of completion of this corner of the campus as well. So we're right on the edge, as you saw in the previous slides. So the massing of the building started to drive the gaps between the buildings, the articulation of the forms of the spaces that sit behind those areas. So basically starting to develop up the support laboratory space, the open labs, and then the workplace, then the atrium as it slides in. So then we clad those areas differently because we see that we need more protection to the labs and the support lab areas. We need less protection to the open space, and we're trying to get that light and that transparency through into this part of the building. So that's it from the other side. So we're looking at this atrium space as a connector between the two buildings. This is really purely these stage one elements. As we then developed it further, we started to look at how we then connect into the stage two building. So we linked all the floors together, we made them all the same height. That created a few challenges with the amount of services that run through these buildings. But basically what we're trying to do is enhance the public space, which is being developed by the previous master plan for the space, bring them into a public space at ground level. We go to what we call the invited space, which is more of the teaching and learning space, which links in with the 2 stories in these buildings of teaching, this building of teaching. And then the private space, which isn't necessarily private, it's just more research-based space that we want to allow the people to have a bit more privacy from the student body. It doesn't mean that they're not coming up into this space, but it's more diagrammatic. And then at ground level, we were looking to open up spaces as much as we could onto the courtyard. So there's a student hub in there, there's a cafe going in there, and there's centrally allocated teaching. So they're places where people are coming and going, so we don't need to control them through the building itself. Oops. But we allow them to directly access, which engages more with this sort of external space. And then this is basically a diagram showing what we were talking about before, where teaching interacts across the precinct at these 2 levels. Then research is still connected at this level, so the connections across make it for one research zone. So again, it's in a simple diagram. We've got the workplace, the open labs, the support laboratories wrapping through, and then the workspace at the end, obviously maintaining the existing fabric of that building, which was also another challenge for what we had to do. I won't go through this too detailed because we've already talked about it, but basically this is the setup of the research zoning in those areas. The facade itself, we looked at the colours that existed on the existing facades. We took the ideas of a biological building. We looked at colours. We looked at the butterfly, the rock. So we've got geology going on in here. We've got biology going on in here, and we ended on a macro view of the butterfly wing, which drives the colour variation that happens in the facade, and that then gets interpreted over the facade. We tried many different versions of this, but we ended with what we've got now, which is essentially, as we developed this facade through, it changed multiple times, but basically it maintained that same approach of the colour variation. And then in the development of the streetscape, we're using the colour variations that are happening here. We're being complementary to them at the end. We're breaking down the form of the building. We were trying to reduce the bulk of this building so it wasn't a big block at the end. And we started to define the research space versus the open workplace space, and then the link between is defined by another form, which is this one behind me. So these were our original 3Ds of the space. And we're also picking up on the colorations that are happening in adjacent buildings. So it's trying to blend and connect the various buildings. This is it as a completed building. So I think we came very close to what we had in our imagery to reality. We've got a terracotta facade which references the other facades in the campus, especially the Tyree building, the Red Centre, and a few other buildings around. And it's a longevity of material. It's a masonry construction that also works well with the Wallace Worth facade. And then when we got inside the courtyard space or the precinct, we were looking at the way the building has two sides to it. So stage 2 started to need a different approach from what was happening in stage 1, and that was based around the lines and forms that were in the existing courtyard space. We didn't want to fight with those. I mean, green versus red would, not be a good look. So we were trying to blend more with what was happening in that space. So as we developed the lines around the building, we looked at the heights and the way that the vertical elements of the facades on these buildings, we didn't want to contrast them with a different building. We wanted to make them feel one of the same family. So we then took our facade on the street. We looked at the Lowy facade and the Wallace Worth facade. We blended those together and came up with what we believe is a complementary version of the facade. So that then took the ideas that we had in terms of pixelation and movement through the facade onto the new facade within the context of the vertical facades that were around in the other areas. And that's essentially the stage 2 look. We still bring some of the colour from our other side of the building, if you want. So the opening of this facade at ground level is to activate the courtyard space. We continue those elements of verticality through the space and create a new focus to the southern part of the campus, or the precinct, which is hopefully going to be very successful. The entry, we've floated the canopy, so that gives protection, allows people to sit up in these spaces, also protects from the sun. It's quite nice the way that the buildings across the way don't overshadow the space, so we were working with that to try and keep the light happening. I think we've gone through most of this before, but basically creating that space between the buildings, which is this area here, and forming up the spaces around the courtyard. We took colour again from the facade and we added it into the building. So as you go up, you have a range of colours that define those spaces. That's where it doesn't work on that. The stairs and why they're different colours, and the signage works around that same basis, and the colours within the laboratories work around that, and hopefully it helps people orientate themselves within the building. This is this is a view looking at this stage 2 building. So we are currently in here. So what we did here was try to create a place for the researchers to come down to. We were purposefully trying to limit the on-floor, sit and have your lunch, come down here and talk, come down here and mix, and try to get that serendipity happening within the researchers. So when we finish, the walls that you see over there will disappear. This will become another atrium space taller than this one, another 2 stories down, so it goes down into the teaching area, so it engages the teaching space to this space, but still keeps it a fairly invited space, if you want, or private space. And just another view of that. It's quite difficult to do all this within code requirements, and the depth of this space is part of that requirement. So we went through a lot of iterations around how to make it work in terms of code compliance, which is fairly complex in this building. And we went through the basis of making it one building. So this is fundamentally one building at the end of the day. So this is the view that we'd be looking at if we were standing on the other side of the building. We would be right down at the end over here, and we're connecting all that through. So I was up there the other day and all the steel's in, so we're getting close. Basically the atrium space, which you're in at the moment, a bit of work to make it all work with structure, but that's where we ended up. And it's quite a positive space. It feels good. It's great in the light that comes down through the skylight, where we've got 50% light, is quite good. The blades direct the light down into the space, and I'm very happy with the quality of light in here during the day. And expression on the end of the building to define this space is quite clean. And then when we get to the facades of the building, the glass box, if you want, of the workplace versus the research space, and then the recess to help define that edge. And that's it. Again, I don't know what the cross is, but anyway. And then colour, which we add a bit of fun into our architecture at the ground. We create places for people to work in an informal way. The same concept of open learning, the teaching on display happening in the distance, and basically taking the cues of the colour from the facade, etc., into those spaces. So these spaces got created around making places for people to feel comfortable in within a larger space, which I think worked quite well, and they seem to be populated when we're there. More of those spaces, again, colour, making the various colours, bringing them into the signage, into the laboratories, where they're reflected by the colours in the building. This is more about light into buildings and vertical facades. I'll go quickly. Basically, these are the spaces where you've got your laboratory space and it's almost seamless to a workplace. So we're trying to connect these guys together. In the distance is another level of support laboratories in that area to the left. Basically more of the same. This is what it looks like without a building. I could explain all the stuff that we're trying to stuff into these buildings. It's quite a feat in trying to work out how to make all these services reticulate through this building and still maintain an open feel. It's quite phenomenal, really. And that doesn't include this building. That's just stage one. And again, the laboratories are on display. Very happy with the way that this laboratory got developed in using the building in a way that its intended use to display those skeletons and things within what they're doing out to the outside. And again, they're all PC2, which is all about control of air and stuff. So you can do it, it's just a bit tighter. That's the original, and that's it. That's our building. Or Jeffrey's.
The university's building.
Yes, exactly.